So we would like to hear from Marcio Castro de Souza.
First of all, it's a great pleasure for FAO to participate in the World Ocean Forum. Unfortunately, we cannot be in presence, but I'm pre-recording this message due to the fact that I'm going to be traveling today when this message is going to be shown. However, I'm going to be to attend live the debate after this presentation. So again, it's a great pleasure for FAO to be here at the World Ocean Forum in this 16th edition. And we really congratulate all the organizers in such an important event. My presentation is going to present basically the trends, challenges, and opportunities that the fisheries and aquaculture sector faces nowadays. And I'm going to basically focus my presentation on some FAO data that we release periodically. But of course, there are some sort of personal interpretation of the data. And I just would like to, as a good lawyer, I just would like to highlight that not necessarily every single issue that I mentioned here is endorsed and it represents the opinion of FAO. So thank you for your understanding on this. My presentation is going to basically touch upon 4 basic characteristics of the global fish markets and try to analyze, based on those 4 characteristics, the main challenges, opportunities, and trends that are occurring at the moment. So, and the first one is a quite obvious one, that we are one of the only animal protein sector that has this duplicity of sources, wild capture and also aquaculture. Then we are going to dive into the strong participation of developing countries in terms of supply of the products at a global level. The importance of international trade is also a very significant pattern that shapes the sector, and also the characteristic of having an extreme long value chain is also an important feature of the sector. As I mentioned before, the majority of the information that I'm going to mention here, they are based on FAO publication, and the flagship publication that we have in the area of fisheries is SOFIA, the State of World Fisheries and Aquaculture, is a publication that we release every 2 years. It was just released last June during the Oceans Conference in Lisbon, Portugal. And it's a very interesting and rich content-wise publication that covers a lot of information, including challenges, deficiencies, but also reporting best practices, reporting the trends, reporting some projections. So I really encourage all of you to download this publication to have a look at it. And I'm going to highlight some of the main messages of this publication. And although all the problems that we have seen at the global level that not only affected fisheries, but affected many of our lives, like the COVID, the pandemic, like the war more recently, the production of fisheries and aquaculture product has never been higher. And we all know also how important fisheries and aquaculture products are indeed in terms of food and nutrition systems. We are forecasting a continuous increase of the sector in terms of production. We have seen a lot of concerns in the global scenario about the increasing population growth and the reduced amount of food that could become available to feed this population increase. However, at the same time, we have noticed that the aquaculture increase of the global supply of fisheries and aquaculture products can indeed be an important element to overcome and to supply the food security and the need for food for this population increase. In addition to that, we have structural problems that continue to affect the sustainability of the sector, like overfishing, pollution. Fisheries management is critical. We are going to see that in more details in a couple of slides. And we have seen also a very positive result in terms of the sustainability levels, that the commercial fisheries landed are increased in a very good sustainable level. That's quite remarkable. Overcapacity is still a problem in many regions in the world, and governments should focus on that too. And maybe the most two comprehensive messages, and some of the two most important messages in order to really understand and have a sustainable industry. First of all, we have to recognize the importance of small-scale producers in the fisheries and aquaculture sector. By the way, we are running, 2022 is the International Year of Small-Scale Fisheries and Aquaculture, and they are crucial in terms of the supply of food, and we have to continue and give more importance in terms of governmental policy and support to them. In addition to that, fisheries and aquaculture products, the industry itself has to be looked in an holistical way. We have to look at, take into consideration the environment, the economic, and the social pillars in order to understand and not to create problems and imbalances within the sector. And when you look about the first pillar that I mentioned to you in terms of the double sourcing of fisheries and aquaculture products, the blue line here shows the production throughout the years of wild capture fisheries, and the orange and the red line, the red area, shows the one coming from aquaculture. You can see that clearly that aquaculture is becoming quite important in the last decades, and it's really important nowadays. And we can say that we have half and half in terms of sources from farmed fish and also from wild capture fish. When you look at the blue area, you can see that more or less the production coming from wild capture is more or less stable around an average, and that's one of the reasons of this clear stability around an average is the status of the global stocks. I'm going to mention that in a couple of minutes, but one issue that's quite important too is that I mentioned the issue of developing countries being critical suppliers of the producers of fisheries and aquaculture products. And in this graph, you can hear clearly China, Indonesia, Peru, India, Vietnam, Russia, Japan, Norway, and Bangladesh as the top countries. And you can see clearly a strong presence of developing countries supplying fish to the world. As I mentioned to you before, the stocks, the global sustainability of stocks are facing problems at the global level. When you see the orange area of this graph, you can see really that the sustainability of the resources at a global level, the overfish stocks are growing in the last years, and the bluish area is decreasing. So the healthy stocks are decreasing. However, when you look at the percentage of the right side of the graph, and you see that the landings of sustainable stocks are quite high. So that's a very positive news. We are landing, so the commercial stocks are being relatively well managed at a global level, and we have reached 82.5% of landings being sustainable at a global level. That's a very strong number. And of course, this is the global number. When you look at the graph, the orange and the bluish areas are the global number of the sustainability of stocks. But when you look at some regional areas, you can see clearly that there are big differences around the world, and some areas are performing quite well. In this graph, the blue part of the pie show the sustainable stocks. So you can see clearly that many areas in the world are performing quite well in terms of sustainability of the stocks. As I mentioned, in terms of the production, we continue to foresee that aquaculture is going to continue to have this substantive increase in production up to 2030, and white capture is going to be more or less around the same average that I was mentioning before. And as one thing that's quite important about fisheries is how inclusive fisheries is for multiple angles. So we are talking about an industry that is important in economic and also in terms of social terms. You can see here, when you look at the post-harvest element, the post-harvest value chain of fisheries and aquaculture products, when you look at the processing part, you see that more than 50% of the workforce is women when you look at the post-harvest part. That's a very strong message in terms of gender inclusion. In addition to that, we can see clearly the economic importance of the sector when you look at the total first sale value of more than $400 billion, from which almost 300 billion are from aquaculture. So those are very, very strong messages in terms of the employment angle and the social part, but also in terms of the economic part. And I mentioned the issue of the importance of small scale, of giving the right importance to the small scale. We know that they contribute substantively to the supply and to the production of fish at the global level. We know that the majority of them, in terms of workforce, it's involved as small-scale fisheries. Also, the participation of developing countries, as I mentioned. So it's an industry that has this inclusion pattern in terms of social, with women, in terms of with gender, social in terms of small-scale producers, and also in terms of the participation of developing countries in providing the supply of fisheries and aquaculture products in the world. So in addition to that, one of the third elements that I was going to mention is the importance of fisheries and aquaculture sector in international terms, in terms of international trade. And I must say that I came originally 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I came originally from the agriculture sector. And when I first calculated this figure that I'm going to show to you, I was shocked. I never thought about this figure in the fishery sector. And this figure is completely astonishing, I must say. And when you look at the global exports of fisheries and aquaculture sector in terms of value, fisheries as an animal protein is more than the sum of beef, poultry, and pork. So we are talking about a sector that exports more in dollar terms than beef, poultry, and pork combined. That's amazing. That's really amazing. A significant part of fish production enters international trade, 37%. We have more than 200 countries involved in international trade, and international trade is growing at a rate of 6.9%. As I mentioned in the beginning, I mentioned all those elements. So a huge participation of developing countries, long value chains, so, the participation of small-scale fisheries, the importance of international trade, all of those elements coming from aquaculture and wild capture, all of those elements, they are going to contribute to create opportunities in the sector, but also that we should be aware of those elements. They also might pose problems for the sector. So this is an issue that I want to highlight here. And when you look at exactly the issue of countries, the participation of countries, fisheries has a completely different pattern from other animal proteins. So this graph was indeed released last week or 10 days ago by the Dutch bank Rabobank. They release annually this trade map, and it shows the trade flows of fisheries and aquaculture products. And one issue that's quite important to mention is that even the big fish producers, they can be also big fish importers, because it's completely impossible for any country in the world to say that they are self-sufficient in terms of fish production, because it's going to have, considering the number of species that we are going to have always a species that the consumers are going to demand, and it's not locally produced. So when you look exactly in terms of the main exporters of fisheries and aquaculture products, you can see traditional ones: China, Norway with salmon and cod and mackerel, Vietnam with pangasius and shrimp, Chile with salmon, India with shrimp, Thailand shrimp, tuna, Netherlands because of the Rotterdam effect of re-exports, Ecuador with tuna and shrimp. So we have these countries, the main exporters. But when you look exactly also at the main importers, you're going to see also many of them that are also big producers, like Japan, like Spain, like France, Italy, US, China. They are also big importers. So that's something very interesting in the fish sector. Not necessarily because you are a big producer, you can also be a big importer of different species that you are not able to locally produce them. And that creates market opportunities for a lot of developing countries, for developed countries, for traditional species, for niche species. So there is a lot of opportunities that this pattern creates. And when we look at the main species that are produced, that are traded in international trade, you just look at the base groups of species. You have salmon as a big group, you have shrimps, and you have squids. Those are the three big groups that are internationally traded. Of course, tuna is also important, but with a small difference between them. But I would say that if you take salmon, tuna, shrimps, and squids, you are covering a substantive amount of the commodities that are internationally traded. And since one of the aspects of this conference is exactly to deal with some trade agreements, I'm going to mention here some modern clauses in trade agreements that go beyond the traditional trade clauses in the fisheries area. And that's particularly interesting because what we are seeing now is that there are some new generation clauses in many preferential trade agreements, particularly in Asia, that covers many sustainability issues like fisheries management, biodiversity conservation, ship pollution, and that's something very interesting because you are only going to be able to reach a country that is part of that trade agreement with a preferential rate, if you comply with those new generation clauses that are not so direct trade linked, but they are direct linked to the fisheries sustainability in the three dimensions of environment, economic, and social. So that's a very important step towards having a more comprehensive approach towards fisheries in preferential trade agreements. When you look at the value chain, I mentioned that we have usually very long value chains in the fisheries and aquaculture sector. And when you look at the value chain of fisheries and aquaculture perspective, this is a very simplistic way. It can be even simpler, but it can go very complex. So it's hard to make a diagram that shows the reality. I try to make it simple for the sake of the reasoning that I'm trying to explain. So we have basically pre-harvest phase in terms of the production, the harvesting phase, transportation, processing, transportation again, distribution, and consumption. So that's the typical, the standard value chain in terms of that we face in terms of the fisheries and aquaculture sector. So one issue that's quite important is that the pre-harvest phase can occur in country A, for example, and then what happened is that the production phase can occur indeed in country B. And then we can go for processing in country C. And then we can go for distribution in country D. So that creates a complexity in terms of borders, in terms of different human resource availability, in terms of labor force, in terms of compliance with different requirements, in terms of legislation. And I'm showing that in particular because that was very significant during the time of the peak of the pandemic, because we have closed borders, we have fishing vessels facing problems in terms of the disembark of the crew, because they are not allowed to disembark in many countries due to restrictions of the pandemic. So this long value chain has the potential, if not well managed, and if it's not, if we do not know how to overcome some of the problems that that the long value chain might cause, that can create additional problems. And that's something that I want to mention now. Of course, it's easy for us to analyze the problems, particularly of the pandemic, after we have seen the problems occur. Of course, it's very difficult to predict things that might occur, but I just would like to mention that we have also other market disruptions in addition to the pandemic. Of course, the pandemic was quite critical. Nowadays, we have all the effects of the war in terms of feed production for aquaculture, freight costs. We have also the constant changes in consumer preferences that was particularly higher during the pandemic, evident during the pandemic times. So we had a lot of changes in consumer preference. This graph shows, just for you to have an illustration, the changes in freight costs in the last years. So that was, however, I just would like to mention that when you look at the crisis that we faced in the last years, there is also an opportunity occurring at the same time. And I'm going to mention some of the opportunities that we have seen in FAO based on research, based on studies conducted with the industry, based with many inputs that we have received from the industry. And again, I just would like to reiterate this aspect that's quite important that we get a direct link with the sector. And I just take this opportunity, this presentation is going to be distributed afterwards. I'm completely available to follow up and be your focal point, your focal entry point in FAO for anything that you need in particular. But some opportunities that we have seen during the pandemic and also during other crises that we are still facing in the sector. Of course, some aquaculture products, like shrimp, for example, they have very short cycles, and that can be very interesting for them to adapt and to react to changes that might occur in the market. So that was something that was very observed in many countries in this regard. In terms of markets, we have seen expansion to alternative markets. We all know that during the pandemic, during the peak of the pandemic, since the pandemic is not over yet, but during the peak of the pandemic, we have seen a lot of many of the hotels and restaurants they have closed, and of course they usually buy very high value-added products in the fisheries and aquaculture value chains. And what we have seen at that time is a diversion of some high-value products to the final consumer directly in supermarkets. And that was very interesting. And what we have seen now that many restaurants and hotels have reopened, we have seen many suppliers keeping the true tracks. So they continue to feed and supply products to the hotel, restaurants, and catering services, but also to supply the same high-value products to final consumers. This issue about exploring local and regional markets vis-a-vis regional, and we are not talking about changing the local to international or vice versa, but we are talking about adding more markets, adding local, adding regional, adding neighboring countries, adding international markets to the regular supply of fisheries and aquaculture products. During the pandemic, we have seen also some new packaging opportunities that has arisen in terms of fish supply. That was very interesting to see new opportunities for other participants of the value chain of the fisheries and aquaculture sector. In terms of demand, we are seeing a lot of changes in the demand, a higher demand for healthier food, particularly a very strong role of the millennials and the Generation X in this demand. A growing import needs by traditional markets. The US is increasing its import in the last years. Home cooking, that became a very hot trend during the pandemic, continue to stay as a concrete option for fisheries and aquaculture products. So this idea about not excluding markets, but rather combining markets is also applicable in terms of the local, regional, and international, but also in terms of the hotel, restaurants, and catering, and the final consumer markets too. So that was something very, very important. As I mentioned, we cannot predict the future. However, information can be a very useful tool for us to provide strong and good elements for us to adapt to changes, to adapt to new trends, and to reduce any kind of vulnerability of the sector. And in this regard, information, as I mentioned, is fundamental. I just would like to mention one FAO project called GLOBEFISH that we handle in our area here in FAO in Rome. It produces a lot of market analysis for the major international products. We produce also a market profile for all countries. I'm illustrating here with China, we have the main products produced by the countries, the main products exported by the country, and the main imported products of the country. At the left top here, we have the GLOBEFISH price dashboard. It's a price dashboard with European prices of fish that is constantly updated. And at the bottom left here, you have a link that you can check all of the main resources directly associated with fish trade at FAO, but also at other international organizations. Again, I would like to thank for this opportunity. It was for me a great pleasure to be here. I'm available live for questions, comments, and please, again, I just would like to reiterate that please use me as your focal point here in FAO for any information that you might need, any support that you might need. Please use me as your entry point. My contacts are going to be distributed, and I'm completely available. So thank you very much. A very good continuation of the event to the organizers, and thank you for inviting FAO to this important and very event. So thank you very much, and have a great day there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Marcio Castro de Souza.